Welcome back to the Ready State. This is case study time. We've got a contact coming in with this information here. I have hypermobile joints, grade 1 spondylolisthesis at L5-S1, a congenital spondylolysis at the same spot, a degenerative disc at the same spot, 20 degrees of scoliosis, and some mild stenosis. And the question is, should any of that change my approach to the bracing sequence and mobilization? So my immediate response is yes, it will make that a little bit more important. And let me just kind of explain some of those terms. I know a lot of us will have some familiarity with that, but just for the whole group to be having the conversation together, if you think of this as kind of the different levels of your spine, this athlete described an L5-S1 issue. So this is your L5 vertebra. This is your S1, right? The interface, the spondy, is this shearing, right? So there's an anterior shifting of the top vertebra over the bottom vertebra. The spondylolisthesis is a failure to have that joint fully fused. So in development, for whatever reason, that bone never really fused. Some of the other issues like a disc degeneration, a stenosis is a narrowing of the spinal canal at that level. And you know, cumulatively as a physical therapist, my interpretation of that is this is a joint segment that is most likely overly flexible and has taken a beating over the last, I don't know how old this athlete is, they didn't mention it in their question, but I'm assuming they're at least not a very young athlete, at least in their 40s or 50s to have had enough time to have this type of damage happen. And essentially, we're talking about a hypermobility problem at its root. And there's a couple of different layers that I'd like to jump into, but Di, what's your impression of this person?
Well, let me just go back a little bit and just appreciate how you actually broke down some of that terminology, because as you were reading that question, I was like, that is in English. So I appreciate the unpackaging of the question itself. So in thinking about an athlete, which I see every single day, athletes with hypermobile low backs. Yeah. Typically, from a strength and conditioning standpoint, we take a look at, what is the ability for the athlete to maintain trunk integrity, and also, how mobile or immobile are their, the hip flexors and extensors.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because if they're overly wound up and overly tight, they're going to end up stealing slack from, the midline.
Right. And, my immediate thought is if I see a segment, especially at the lumbar spine, right at that kind of lumbosacral interface, if that segment is hypermobile, does that mean that the hips are going to be hypomobile, right? Mm-hmm. This is going back to kind of the foundations of Gray Cook, that you have alternating levels of stability and mobility. So what we really want is to have mobile hips and be able to selectively stabilize the lumbar spine. But we actually see the athletic pattern is to have very stiff hips and a very hypermobile lower back. So one of the things I also want to appreciate there is this athlete talked about a 20-degree scoliosis, which is going to be a curve roughly about that much in their lumbar spine. And when I'm training an athlete who has a scoliosis, I have to appreciate that they have extra dimensions. There's an extra complexity. They're playing three-dimensional chess with their pelvis while they're trying to squat. Where like a normal athlete, we really just have to worry about the sagittal plane. Are they going to overextend or flex under that load? Whereas this athlete may start with a big shift, and we have to think like, is this person going to rotate into that? Is this person going to have a side bend? And also they still have to manage the same flexion and extension in that same direction that everybody else does. So they have 3 planes of motion that they've got to be aware of. And that adds like 2 degrees of magnitude. It's not like twice as hard for them to manage their stability. It's like 20 times as hard for them to manage their stability, because there's so many different kind of cut along the dotted line places where they might tend to have it break.
And what would your solve be for an athlete that has these set of challenges to face? Like for me, my inclination is almost, maybe a little counterintuitive, which is to change the environment and actually make it a little less stable. So they have to drive the focus internally to find that and learn the stability within themselves.
Yeah, I think that's a very valid strategy. I'll just sort of say that in the world of scoliosis rehab, there's a few different models. And I think one of the common ones is whatever degree you curve, you get forced to try to move in the opposite direction, which is all well and good, but this person has a hypermobility problem. And adding more mobility into that solution is just going to make it even more complicated for them to find some stability. So my general thought is, I want to give them, this is the way that I start. I would give them the most stable environment they possibly can. And we want to kind of piece by piece from the base up, try to build stability. So this athlete's question was specifically like, how important is bracing? It's like, the most important
thing you can do for yourself. Yeah.
But that's a very easy thing for us to just sit here and say like, yeah, bracing, it's really important. You should probably do it. How you actually put that together is going to be a process of trial and error. You have to create a very safe space for this person to be able to make mistakes. Any learning that you do has to be both easy enough that you're successful most of the time, challenging enough that you can make some errors. If you are 100% successful, you're not learning anything. If you're 0% successful, you're not learning anything. I always default to about 80 or 90%, but you also have to choose exercise selection and degree of difficulty is going to be really, really important. This person talked about, 3 to 5 different pathologies, each of which could be creating their own unique kind of low back pain. And what's the arrow, or what's the buffer for error in this system? If this person can make one error and then they have 6 months of excruciating back pain, like that's not the kind of margin of error that I'm comfortable having a person practice within. If it's within a small degree of difference, it's a small shift, they just noticed they weren't accurate, there's no pain associated with that, that's kind of preferable, right? I want this person to be able to practice in an environment where we've created parameters where they're not likely to exacerbate any pain or make that process worse.
Right. So what I'm hearing you say is continue with the strength and training protocol. However, you may need to be mindful of what movements you're selecting to try and solve these set of issues for the athlete.
Right, and just respecting that this person has so many more places. They don't break in one direction, they break in multiple directions simultaneously. And as opposed to if I bend this way, just teaching someone to go this way, how do I teach them to brace into that and resist? And this is kind of like the classic anti-rotation training. We'll see unilateral things like that, a thing like a pale-off press or something like that, where they have to resist rotating with the direction. You have to teach them, how do you create the right amount of bracing? You're not just rotating the opposite way, but you're resisting, just kind of giving into that curve.
Right, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So to answer this person's question, bracing, really important, but also is a complex process, and you might have to do tempo isometric, kind of the classic slow down, establish good positions. And then eventually I do want to put this person into very challenging positions. I do want to give them some weight too. One of the things I think many times, at least I failed to appreciate early in my career, is that unweighted is actually a challenging condition because the feedback situation is very low. But you hand someone a little bit of weight and they're like, oh, I know where I am in space now. Like, I don't need 90% of their 1RM to find that. But 10 or 20% can actually make it a little easier, not more difficult.
Yeah, I've noticed a similar thing, and using, again, Olympic-style weightlifting as a proxy. The feedback from athletes oftentimes is, especially when we're moving quickly, they're like, I have no idea where the barbell is in space relative to my system. Right? But you give them a little bit of load, and they can suddenly get the feedback, they can feel the bar, they know where they are in space, they can find their positions a little better. And then what we do is we backfill that with a bunch of volume until they can gain that internal mastery without the weights being present.
Right.